War, they say, is fought with guns, tanks, and courage. But in the hidden chambers of power, in whispered conversations, and in coded messages carried by unseen hands, there's another war that shapes everything. The war of information. In that silent battlefield, Juan Pujol García was a soldier unlike any other, a man who never fired a weapon in anger, never commanded an army, and yet misled one of the greatest war machines in history. His battleground was deception. His weapon was belief. His story begins in Barcelona, under the suffocating heat of political division and fear. Spain had been torn apart by civil war, and Pujol had seen firsthand what extremism could do to a country. He despised fascism, not from books or speeches, but from watching his homeland consumed by it. He saw men turn into monsters by ideology, and he swore that he would never again serve tyranny in any form. Yet fate has a cruel sense of irony, because the path that would one day make him a hero began with a lie so bold, so absurd, that it should never have worked. In 1940, as Europe burned and the world trembled under Nazi conquest, Pujol was a man without power, training, or influence, but he had conviction. He wanted to help the Allies stop Hitler's regime, to fight for truth in a world built on lies. So he did what few would dare. He walked into the offices of British intelligence and offered his services as a spy. The British politely refused. Who was he, after all? Just a Spanish hotel manager with no military background, no connections, and no reason to be trusted. But what the British dismissed as foolishness, the Germans would soon mistake for brilliance. Instead of giving up, Pujol decided to create his own destiny. If the Allies wouldn't hire him, he would make himself indispensable to them. He invented an identity, a pro-Nazi Spaniard living in Lisbon, loyal to Hitler and eager to serve the Third Reich. With fake credentials, a forged background, and the confidence of a born storyteller, he approached the German embassy and offered to spy on Britain for them. The Germans took the bait. They gave him money, invisible ink, and a mission. Go to London and report on the movements of the British military. What they didn't know was that Pujol had never set foot in England. From a small hotel room in Lisbon, he began sending reports, fabricated, detailed, but believable. He built an entire world out of fiction, imaginary agents stationed across Britain, each with their own stories, relationships, and coded messages. He invented weather conditions, troop movements, ship names, and even gossip from soldiers in pubs. Every letter he sent was a masterpiece of storytelling, just realistic enough to be trusted, just vague enough to never be disproven. He even used a map of Britain from a public library to make his lies sound local. And the Germans believed every word. Months passed, and his fake intelligence started moving through the arteries of the German war machine. His imaginary spy network grew to 20, then 30 agents. Some of them were supposedly pilots, others officers, dock workers, or typists in the War Office. None of them existed, but all of them were being paid. The Germans, satisfied with the quality of the information, began sending him more money. Money he spent not on espionage, but on making his fiction even more convincing. He kept detailed records, created fake letters from his agents, and wrote with the emotional realism of someone who had seen the things he described. His talent for lying became an art form. At first, British intelligence still had no idea who he was. They were receiving occasional reports from the Germans about an extraordinary Spanish source, but they didn't know this ghost was the same man they had turned away. It wasn't until late 1942, when his reports began indirectly helping Allied operations, that MI5 decided to track him down. They found him in Lisbon, calm, polite, utterly untrained, and yet operating one of the most effective deception networks of the war. The British couldn't believe what they were seeing. This civilian had done, single-handedly, what an entire department of intelligence were trying to do: create a believable illusion powerful enough to deceive the aware, the German military intelligence. When they finally met him face to face, Pujol wasn't a man of swagger or mystery. He was gentle, almost shy, with a quiet passion that burned beneath the surface. He told them everything: his motives, his lies, his hatred of fascism, and the British realized something profound. They weren't just looking at a liar. They were looking at an artist of deception. From that day forward, Juan Pujol García was no longer just a Spanish volunteer. He was Agent Garbo, a name chosen to reflect his ability to act with the grace and conviction of a world-class performer. That moment changed everything. With MI5's help, his fake spy network became a cornerstone of the Allied deception strategy. The man who had started with nothing was now one of the most valuable assets in the secret war. But even as his lies grew more elaborate, Pujol never lost sight of his purpose. He wasn't doing this for glory or power. He was doing it to fight the kind of cruelty that had destroyed his country. And somewhere deep down, he must have known that his lies were saving lives. As the war entered its deadliest years, Agent Garbo's illusions would soon play a role far beyond imagination, one that would shape the fate of D-Day itself. When the British brought Juan Pujol García to London, they didn't just gain a spy. They gained a storyteller capable of bending reality itself. It was 1942, and the tide of war was still uncertain. The Allies had tasted small victories in North Africa, but Hitler's forces still dominated much of Europe. Every operation, every invasion, depended on secrecy and deception. And Pujol, the man who had once lied his way into the German network, was about to become the cornerstone of one of the greatest acts of strategic deception in history. MI5 settled him into a quiet flat in London and assigned him a case officer, a sharp, composed man named Tomás Harris, who, like Pujol, was of Spanish descent. The two bonded instantly. Harris understood Pujol's humor, his subtle irony, and his obsession with detail. Together, they would craft an illusion so convincing that it would reshape the German understanding of the war. They built upon the foundation Pujol had already laid, the fake network of imaginary agents. But under MI5 supervision, that network became more sophisticated, more complex, more alive. They gave the network a name, Operation Garbo. Pujol's imaginary agents now had entire life stories, families, and financial accounts. MI5 even helped him create fake radio transmissions and letters, written in different handwriting styles to match each invented spy. Some of the agents reported from ports in Liverpool, others from military bases in Scotland, others from political circles in London. One agent was supposedly a Welsh nationalist with a grudge against the British government, another a Venezuelan student sympathetic to fascism. Each character was carefully crafted to reflect the real social mosaic of wartime Britain. Every week, Pujol and Harris would compose reports that were fed to the Germans through coded radio transmissions. These reports contained just enough truth to be credible, details about bombings, rationing, or troop movements, but were always slightly distorted to protect real operations. The Germans devoured it all. They praised their brilliant agent in London, codenamed Arabelle, unaware that this same man was living under British protection, using their own money to deceive them. By late 1943, Pujol's influence inside the German intelligence network was enormous. The Abwehr considered him one of their most reliable sources. His reports reached the highest ranks of the German military, even landing on Hitler's desk. And yet, Pujol was never arrogant about it. He remained calm, disciplined, driven by a simple principle: that truth could sometimes be served through lies. The war was reaching a critical moment. The Allies were preparing for the greatest amphibious invasion in history, D-Day, the assault on Nazi-occupied France. The entire operation depended on one thing: surprise. If the Germans guessed a wrong location of the invasion, thousands of Allied lives could be saved. But if they discovered the real target, Normandy, before the attack began, it could turn into a bloodbath. The Allied command decided to launch a deception campaign, codenamed Operation Fortitude. Its goal was to convince the Germans that the invasion would come not in Normandy, but at the Pas de Calais, a narrower section of the French coast closer to Britain. Pujol was chosen as the heart of this operation. His credibility with the Germans was so high that whatever he said, they believed without hesitation. His fictional network would now feed an avalanche of misinformation, reports about fake army divisions, imaginary generals, and non-existent troop buildups. MI5 and the Allies constructed an entire phantom army to back his lies. They built inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and fake landing craft along the southeast coast of England. They even assigned his fictional force a commander, General George S. Patton, because his reputation for aggression made the illusion even more believable. Through Pujol's reports, the Germans were told that the Allies were preparing to invade Calais, not Normandy. He described massive troop movements, detailed supply routes, and even complaints from imaginary officers about the weather. The Germans trusted him completely. They adjusted their defenses, shifting troops and resources toward the wrong coast. And when the real invasion began on June 6, 1944, at Normandy, they were still waiting for a main assault that would never come. For hours, as Allied soldiers stormed the beaches, the German High Command hesitated to react. Pujol sent urgent messages insisting that Normandy was just a feint, a distraction, and that the true attack was yet to come at Calais. The Germans believed him. For 2 crucial weeks, they refused to move their armored divisions from Calais. Those lost days saved countless lives and ensured the success of the invasion. The beauty of the deception wasn't in its complexity, but in its simplicity. It worked because one man had built a reputation strong enough to outweigh reality. Hitler himself issued orders based on Pujol's lies, convinced that he was receiving pure truth from London. And yet, amid all the chaos, Pujol never lost sight of the cost of what he was doing. Every decision, every report he sent, carried the weight of human lives. He knew that his lies could save thousands, but a single miscalculation could also cost him. The responsibility was immense, and it haunted him in quiet moments between missions. When the Allies finally secured their foothold in Normandy and began the liberation of France, the full impact of Operation Fortitude became clear. Historians would later say that Pujol's deception shortened the war and saved tens of thousands of soldiers from dying on the beaches. But in that summer of 1944, as the world celebrated victory, Pujol remained in the shadows, writing one final series of reports to ensure the Germans continued to believe the invasion at Calais was imminent. Even as Allied tanks rolled across France, the Germans still waited for an attack that would never arrive. It was a perfect illusion, and Pujol had carried out so convincingly that the German High Command awarded him the Iron Cross, one of their highest military honors, for his service to the Reich. The irony was staggering. The man who had dedicated his life to deceiving the Nazis was being honored by them for his loyalty. But his mission wasn't over yet. The war was turning, but the deception had continued until Germany's surrender. And for Pujol, the deeper question was beginning to emerge. After living a life built entirely on lies, could he ever return to truth again? When the first reports of the Normandy invasion reached Berlin, chaos spread to the German command like wildfire. Hitler's generals demanded clarity. Where were the rest of the Allied forces? When would the main attack begin? And there, in the middle of this confusion, stood a man they would never meet, whose quiet voice in London dictated their every move. Juan Pujol García, Agent Garbo, was now shaping the destiny of nations from shadows. His words were worth more to the Germans than the testimony of their own officers on the ground. And yet, inside the small, smoke-filled MI5 office where he worked with Thomas Harris, the atmosphere was far from triumphant. Pujol knew what a success meant. Thousands of men were fighting and dying because the enemy had believed the stories. Every false message that delayed a German division in Calais gave the Allies another chance to survive, but every minute he hesitated risked exposure. The line between truth and illusion had blurred beyond recognition. In those days after D-Day, London felt different. Bombs still fell, sirens still wailed, but there was a new rhythm in the air, the pulse of hope. Pujol would sit in his small flat, typing coded messages in a mixture of Spanish, English, and German, feeding the Germans an endless stream of invented intelligence. He described how the main invasion army, under General Patton, was still waiting to cross the Channel, how supply ships were being refitted in Kent, how thousands of men were positioned for a second strike at Calais. And the Germans believed it so deeply that even weeks after the beaches of Normandy were secure, they refused to redeploy their troops. For over a month, 10 German divisions sat idle near Calais, staring at the sea, waiting for ghosts. By then, Pujol's double life had reached a strange, almost surreal balance. To the Germans, he was Arabelle, a loyal spy serving the Reich, admired by his handlers in Madrid and Berlin. To the British, he was Garbo, a national hero of deception, one of the most valuable intelligence assets of the entire war. And yet in his own heart, he was still just Juan Pujol García, a man from Barcelona who hated violence and believed he was fighting for peace through lies. Every night, when he left MI5 headquarters. He would walk home through streets darkened by blackout curtains and think about the absurdity of it all. The world was tearing itself apart with bombs and tanks, and here he was saving lives with typewriter keys and ink. The Germans continued to shower him with praise. They sent him bonuses, new codes, and eventually that Medal of Honor, the Iron Cross, an award usually reserved for those who had shed blood for the Reich. It was a gesture so absurd that even the British found it hard to believe. They laughed, then quickly realized how dangerous it was. Pujol had become too important. The Germans might eventually demand a meeting, a photograph, something tangible. So MI5 crafted a new layer of deception to protect him. They created more imaginary intermediaries, claiming Arabelle was now deeply embedded in military command and too vital to risk exposure. It worked. The Germans were satisfied, convinced that their Spanish spy in London was untouchable. But success brought exhaustion. The constant lying, the endless code work, the emotional strain of living under two identities began to consume him. His wife, Araceli, had joined him in London, and even she struggled to understand the world her husband lived in. She saw the long hours, the sleepless nights, the letters written in invisible ink, and the quiet tension behind his calm expression. Pujol rarely spoke about his fears, but sometimes, in the stillness of dawn, he would confess that he no longer knew who he truly was. He had built so many personas: Arabelle, Garbo, the dutiful husband, the loyal agent, that the real one felt like just another disguise. Outside his window, London was slowly coming back to life. By 1945, victory seemed within reach. Allied troops were advancing across Europe, the Nazi Empire crumbling piece by piece. Pujol kept playing his part until the very end, continuing to send misleading reports even as the German front collapsed. His messages painted a picture of strength where there was none, of order where chaos reigned. He fed the illusion until it became unsustainable. And then, finally, when Berlin fell and the war in Europe ended, Agent Garbo vanished from the stage he had dominated for years. The world celebrated victory. Crowds filled the streets. Soldiers kissed strangers. Flags waved across continents. But for Pujol, there was no celebration. He had no medals to show, no public applause, no official acknowledgement. His entire contribution had been classified, hidden behind the walls of secrecy. He was a ghost of victory, a man who had changed history and would never be known for it. MI5 quietly thanked him, paid his final salary, and let him fade away. The irony was almost poetic. The Germans had given him one of their highest honors, and the British soon followed by awarding him the Member of the Order of the British Empire. Two enemies, united only in admiration for a man who had deceived them both. In a single lifetime, Juan Pujol García had achieved the impossible. He was decorated by both sides of a world war for doing the exact same job. But the applause that never came from the public didn't matter as much as what he carried inside. Because deep down, he knew that his lies had saved more lives than most soldiers ever could. He had turned deceit into a weapon for peace. And yet, when the world began to rebuild, he found himself haunted by an unbearable question. What becomes of a man whose entire identity was built on illusion? As Europe rebuilt itself from the ruins and heroes returned home, Garbo disappeared into silence. And in that silence began the next chapter of his story, the one where the spy without a gun tried to live a life without secrets. After the war ended, Europe was a continent of ghosts. Cities were scarred, nations were exhausted, and the world was trying to remember how to breathe again. For most people, the guns had fallen silent. For Juan Pujol García, the silence was unbearable. He had spent years living in a world of deception and danger, where every letter, every code, every word could decide life or death. Then suddenly there was nothing. No coded messages, no handlers, no reports. Just ordinary life, and ordinary life felt foreign to him. He had achieved something extraordinary. His lies had fooled Hitler himself. His fake army had drawn German divisions away from Normandy. He had been decorated by both sides of the war. And yet, when peace came, there was no place for a man like him. Spies vanish when the smoke clears, because their value lies in secrets, and peace demands truth. For the British, Garbo had served his purpose. For the Germans, Arabelle had been their greatest illusion. And for Juan Pujol García, the man behind both names, it was time to disappear. He left London quietly in 1945. MI5 helped arrange a new identity for him, a quiet farewell after years of service. His wife, Araceli, struggled to adjust. She had endured years of fear, isolation, and secrecy, always unsure when or if her husband's lies might catch up with them. The tension between them grew until it finally broke. Pujol decided to stage his own death, not as a spy, but as a man seeking freedom. In 1949, reports emerged that Juan Pujol García had died of malaria in Angola. The world believed it. Even his family accepted the story. Newspapers printed small obituaries, and history closed its chapter. The man who had tricked the Nazis into believing fiction had now tricked the entire world into mourning a death that never happened. In reality, he was alive and living under the radar somewhere in South America. For years, he drifted through different countries, eventually settling in Venezuela. He opened a small business, kept a low profile, and spoke little about the past. To his neighbors, he was just a polite, quiet Spaniard who ran a modest bookshop and occasionally helped teach. They didn't know that he had once held the fate of Europe in his hands. He avoided politics, avoided fame, avoided anything that might connect him to the man he used to be. After all, Garbo had been a ghost during the war. Now he was a ghost in peace. But the past has a way of finding even those who wish to forget it. Decades later, as historians began piecing together the secret operations of World War II, a few curious researchers stumbled across strange inconsistencies in the records. They found reports of a Spanish double agent who had misled the Germans before D-Day, but his name seemed lost. The Germans had called him Arabelle. The British files mentioned Garbo. And then someone noticed that both stories ended the same way, with a man who had supposedly died of malaria. Something didn't add up. In the 1970s, a British historian named Nigel West became obsessed with uncovering the truth. He believed Garbo might still be alive. He followed the trail from old MI5 archives to Spanish family records, then across the Atlantic to South America. Years passed before a single clue appeared. A vague report of a Spaniard living quietly in Caracas, Venezuela. West traveled there, skeptical but hopeful. When he finally met the man face to face, he realized he was standing before the ghost of World War II. Juan Pujol García was in his 70s, thin, soft-spoken, with a calm intelligence in his eyes. When West revealed who he was and what he had done, Pujol smiled gently and said something that captured the essence of his entire life. "I only did what I believed was right." He had spent 30 years hiding in plain sight, content to live without recognition, without fame, without reward. And yet, when the world rediscovered him, it was as if the fog of history had cleared for just a moment to reveal the man behind the myth. By then, the Cold War had divided the world again, and the art of deception had become more dangerous than ever. But Garbo's kind of deception was different. It had been born not of greed or ideology, but of moral clarity. He had lied to save lives, not to take them. In a century defined by propaganda and manipulation, that distinction mattered. When he was finally invited back to Europe, the British government welcomed him quietly. He visited the Normandy beaches he had helped protect, standing on the sand where thousands of young men had lived because his words had delayed an army. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to feel something close to peace. He had lived to see the world free from the tyranny he once fought with ink and paper. But he also knew the cost of it all. The families who never knew their loved ones' deaths had been postponed by a lie. The soldiers who had marched into battle believing in an illusion crafted by his hand. The war might have ended, but the memories of those choices never truly left him. When people asked how he managed to deceive both Hitler and the British command, Pujol never bragged. He said it came down to one thing: imagination. He understood how people wanted to believe certain truths, and he gave them what they needed to hear. He once joked that his greatest skill wasn't espionage, it was storytelling. Because in the end, that's what every lie is, a story told well enough to make the listener forget it's false. In Venezuela, he continued to live quietly until his final years, surrounded by a small circle of friends and his second family. He never sought money or recognition for what he had done. When journalists occasionally reached out, he answered humbly, often saying he didn't consider himself a hero. He said heroes were the men who fought, the ones who bled on the beaches he had helped save. He was just a man who used words instead of bullets. But the truth was larger than his humility. In the great web of World War II, his role was invisible but monumental. His lies changed the shape of reality. His fiction saved thousands from dying, and his silence afterward preserved the dignity of it all. As he grew older, Garbo's legend became something almost poetic, a reminder that wars aren't only fought by soldiers, but also by dreamers, liars, and storytellers who reshape the world with nothing more than conviction and creativity. In his quiet apartment in Caracas, surrounded by books and memories, he lived the rest of his life as peacefully as the world he had helped win. He died there in 1988, at the age of 76, far from the battlefields and the nations that once depended on his words. But his story lived on, told in whispers and declassified files, in the minds of those who still try to understand how one man's imagination could fool an empire. When Juan Pujol García finally allowed himself to live as a normal man, something inside him remained restless. The world had changed, but the questions that haunted him never truly faded. What was truth, after all? What was a lie, when a lie had saved thousands? Could deceit ever be moral if its purpose was to protect? These questions lingered in the quiet corners of his mind, echoing like the faint static of an old radio long after the signal fades. The war had ended, but the moral puzzles of his life were eternal. He had built a career on illusions that saved real people. He had created entire armies that never existed, and yet their phantom presence had altered history. Every life spared on the beaches of Normandy, every soldier who lived because the Germans waited for a fake invasion at Calais, was a reminder that sometimes the line between right and wrong is not drawn in black and white. It's drawn in gray ink, invisible until time reveals its shape. Pujol had seen how men could be blinded by belief. He understood that truth was not always what people wanted. It was what they chose to accept. The Germans believed in him because he told them what they already wanted to hear, that they were still in control, that the Allies' plans were predictable, that their empire could still be defended. He didn't just lie to them. He fed their arrogance until it became their downfall. That was his genius. He used the enemy's uncertainty against them. In conversations during his later years, he often reflected on that subtle art of deception. The best lie, he once said softly, is not the one that sounds true. It's the one that feels true. He had learned that during the darkest days of war, every message he sent, every character he invented, was built on emotional realism. He gave his fictional agents flaws, personalities, and motives because he knew humans trust imperfection more than perfection. He built trust with his enemies by making his lies human. But being human also meant carrying guilt. Pujol's mind was a battlefield of contradictions. He was proud of what he'd done, yet haunted by the cost. He knew his lies had saved countless Allied lives, but he also knew that deception, once used, changes the soul. For years, he had lived by pretending to be someone else, and sometimes he feared he had lost himself in those layers of disguise. The quiet streets of Caracas were peaceful, but in that peace, he found too much time to think. At night, he sometimes dreamed of radio codes and false reports. He heard the sound of typewriter keys and the faint voices of his imaginary agents. They had all been inventions, yet they lived in his mind as real as old friends. He could still remember their names: the dock worker, the secretary, the student in Glasgow, the pilot who never existed but whose letters he had once written by candlelight. They were part of him, fragments of his imagination that had shaped the course of war. In those dreams, they spoke to him as if asking, was it worth it? He would wake up in the dark, look around the small room where he lived, and whisper to himself, yes, it was. Because even if the world would never understand it, he knew that what he did had meaning. He had fought tyranny with illusion, and somehow illusion had triumphed over terror. He had turned lies into a shield for truth. When historians rediscovered him, some called him a hero, others called him a genius, and a few even questioned the morality of his work. But Garbo himself rejected all of those labels. He said, I am not a hero. I am just a man who could not stay silent. To him, heroism was not about courage under fire. It was about moral endurance. It was about doing something that no one would ever see, knowing that it mattered even if no one ever said thank you. He also believed his greatest weapon wasn't intelligence or cunning. It was conviction. He once explained that to deceive someone completely, you first have to believe in your own story. During the war, he convinced himself that every lie he told was a truth of another kind. The truth of purpose, the truth of duty. That self-belief made his deception unbreakable. It's what separated him from ordinary spies. Others lied for money or power. He lied for something far more intangible, the idea that good could win if someone dared to fight evil on its own terms. As the years passed, Pujol's story became something larger than the man himself. He became a symbol of the hidden war, the invisible front where ideas, illusions, and narratives decided the fate of nations. In a century obsessed with propaganda, his life was a proof that sometimes the strongest weapons are not bullets but beliefs. By the 1980s, as television documentaries and books began to uncover his role, people were fascinated by how one man could manipulate both sides of a global conflict. They expected arrogance or pride when they met him, but they found humility instead. He spoke of the war with a quiet sadness, never with celebration. He said he did not hate the Germans, nor did he glorify the Allies. He said he hated cruelty, and that was all. In one rare interview, he said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. I was only a small man in a big storm, but sometimes a small man can change the direction of the wind. It was a simple sentence, yet it carried the essence of his life. A reminder that influence does not always come from strength or authority, but from persistence and imagination. He died without riches, without fame, but with a legacy that still defies belief. Even today, historians call Operation Fortitude one of the most successful deceptions in modern warfare. It wasn't one with technology or power, but with trust that one man built, nurtured, and weaponized through nothing more than words. For Pujol, that trust was both his triumph and his burden, because in the end, he knew that trust is sacred, and he had used it to lie. But maybe that's what makes a story so profoundly human. He lived in the space between right and wrong, between truth and illusion, and showed the world that sometimes the price of peace is not only paid in blood, but in honesty too. As the last years of his life drifted by, Juan Pujol García remained a man of quiet contradictions. He had outlived the war, outlived his enemies, and even outlived the lies that had once defined him. In his small apartment in Caracas, he spent his mornings reading newspapers, sipping coffee, and reflecting on a world that had changed faster than anyone could have imagined. Men were walking on the moon, the Berlin Wall was rising and falling, and yet the same human frailties, fear, ambition, pride, still ruled the world. He had seen how belief could move armies, and now he watched how belief could still divide nations. History, he thought, never truly learns. It only repeats with different names. Sometimes, old friend from London or Madrid would write to him. They would tell him about the documentaries being made, the new books about his story, the conferences where his name was whispered with awe. He always responded with kindness, but he kept his distance. He had lived too long in shadows to ever be comfortable in light. Fame was something he had spent his whole life avoiding. He once said that if people remembered him, he wanted them to remember the idea, not the man. The idea that courage doesn't always wear uniform, that heroism can exist in the invisible spaces of history. When he walked through the streets of Caracas, no one recognized him. He liked it that way. The fruit vendors, the taxi drivers, the children playing football in the streets, all of them saw just another old man passing by. None of them could have guessed that he had once been the invisible hand guiding the course of a war. Sometimes when he looked at their faces, he felt a deep peace. These people were living the life he had fought for, a world without bombs, without uniforms, without fear. That was enough. He never grew bitter about being forgotten. For him, obscurity was not punishment. It was freedom. He had spent too many years being two men at once. Arabelle, the German spy who never existed, and Garbo, the British agent who lived inside lies. Now, at last, he could be simply Juan. No codes, no reports, no masks. Just a man who had done what he believed was right and accepted that few would ever understand it. Still, every so often, the ghost of the past would return, When he read about new wars, new dictators, new propaganda campaigns, he felt a familiar chill. He understood too well how easily people could be manipulated, how fragile truth could be in the hands of power. He wondered if humanity would ever learn that lies, once unleashed, have a life of their own. Perhaps that was his deepest regret. Not the lies he told during the war, but the lies that came after, the ones that continued shaping the world in more dangerous ways. His deception had been used to protect, but others had learned how to use deception to control. That thought troubled him deeply. Yet despite those doubts, Pujol never lost faith in human decency. He believed people were capable of both great destruction and great compassion. He had seen it in the soldiers who risked their lives for strangers, in the ordinary citizens who shared bread during bombings, in the quiet defiance of those who refused to surrender their humanity even in the darkest times. That, he thought, was the real story of the war, not the battles, not the victories, but the endurance of conscience. In the end, his story became a reflection of that same endurance. A man with no weapons, no army, and no formal training had managed to outwit the most feared regime in modern history. He had done it not through violence, but through imagination. It's strange to think that imagination, a word often reserved for artists and dreamers, became the tool that saved lives. But that was the truth of Garbo's genius. He turned imagination into armor. If you trace the story of World War II from the beaches of Normandy to the ruins of Berlin, there are thousands of names carved into the pages of history. Generals, politicians, resistance fighters. Yet somewhere between those grand figures stands Juan Pujol García, a man who never fired a shot, but whose words echoed louder than gunfire. His lies built bridges across chaos. His courage lived in the unseen, where truth and falsehood danced dangerously close. He once said that he didn't regret deceiving the Germans, but he did regret how much trust they had placed in him. "It made me sad," he said quietly, "because they believed me with such faith." That single sentence captured the tragic irony of his life. His greatest strength was his ability to be believed, and his greatest sorrow was knowing that belief was misplaced. When he died in 1988, the world barely noticed. No parades, no headlines, no ceremonies. But perhaps that was fitting. His entire life had been about working unseen. Even in death, he slipped quietly into the background of history, exactly where it always belonged. And yet, the silence that followed was not emptiness. It was respect. The people who knew his story understood that some heroes don't need applause. Their legacy is written in the peace they leave behind. Today, when historians speak of Agent Garbo, they speak of him as the man who fooled Hitler, the double agent who made D-Day possible, the master of deception. But beneath those titles lies something far more important. The reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through typewriter keys, hidden in the ink of invisible letters, carrying a quiet conviction that truth, no matter how fragile, can survive even when wrapped in lies. Juan Pujol García's story is not just about war. It's about humanity, the strange balance between good and evil, trust and betrayal, illusion and reality. It's about how one man proved that even in an age of destruction, imagination could still be used to protect life. He lived in a world built on deceit and turned it into a weapon for justice. And perhaps that's why, long after his name fades from memory, his story will still matter. Because every generation faces its own kind of war, not always with bullets, but with truth itself. And somewhere in those quiet battles of conscience, there will always be a little of Agent Garbo, the man who fought fascism with fiction, and who taught the world that sometimes the most powerful act of war is to lie for the sake of truth,